The question is that the Appropriation 2010-11 Estimates Bill be now read a second time. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the words after that be omitted and the following substituted. This House has no confidence in the National Government led by John Key, which has blatantly broken its promise not to increase goods and services tax, has pushed up prices when working people have had the lowest wage rise in more than a decade, has failed to implement a plan for jobs, lacks any vision for a smart, high-skill, high-tech and high-wage economy, has cut services and assistance to the most needy in this country, and has rewarded the most wealthy at the expense of the middle and low-income New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, today the National Government had the opportunity to deliver a budget that was fair for all New Zealanders, a budget for the many, not the few. Today, the National Party had the chance to produce a budget that invested in the future, a budget that promoted a modern, smart economy with more and better jobs and higher wages. Mr. Speaker, this National-led government has failed absolutely in those objectives. There were no new ideas to create jobs and the future they need. Instead, they have pushed up the price of just about every good or service that New Zealanders buy. They have borrowed extra to give a windfall to the most wealthy people in this country. They have broken their promises to senior citizens, and they have created the highest level of inflation in decades, nearly 6%. Mr. Speaker, in the time that we've had, our estimate is that average earners will be $30 a week worse off after inflation. $30 a week worse off after inflation. Those on the average wage will get a $15 a week tax cut. That means that goods and services going up by $45 a week. That leaves them $30 a week worse off by Mr. English's own figures, Mr. Speaker. The top 1% of income earners will get 12 times the cut in their income tax of the average earner. 12 times the cut of the average earner, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is a short-term plan that will look after the interests of the highest income earners, which this national government represents. But it is a budget that comes with a huge cost. And it was ironic to listen to the National Party backbenchers cheering the figures on health. Why would they cheer the figures on health when those figures left a $300 million gap in maintaining health services even at the current level? A $300 million hole in the health budget. And Mr. Speaker, when you look at education, there is not the additional funding in education that will even come near to meeting the cost of extra inflation. And if you take the critical area of education, where the foundation is laid for our children to learn, early childhood education, you see a slashing of $400 million over 4 years. $400 million over 4 years. And my challenge to the Prime Minister is, how will that cut be met? will that be additional fees on all of those who are trying to get a quality early childhood education for their families, or will it mean a cut to the quality of early childhood education? Either way, Mr. Speaker, that is a disastrous failure to invest in the future of our country, which is our children, Mr. Speaker. Before the election, Mr. Key promised that the average wage earner would get a tax cut of $50 a week. That, Mr. Speaker, has not eventuated. There is no $50 a week tax cut for the average income earner. Mr. Speaker, they promised tax cuts. Last year they cancelled the tax cuts and they talked about a tax switch. But this year, Mr. Speaker, what they have actually delivered is a tax swindle. A tax swindle. No $50 a week tax cut for those on the average wage. And they did what they never told New Zealanders they were going to do. They said they promised income tax cuts, but they never told New Zealanders that they'd be paying for those cuts themselves through the increase in GST. In fact, Mr. Key, 2 weeks before the election, stood up, looked down the barrel of the camera and said, National will not be increasing GST. And every time he denies and tries to qualify that, his credibility goes down. That is a broken promise by the national government, Mr. Speaker. This budget will do nothing to create jobs or fix the problems that need to be fixed for New Zealand. Well, Bill English is interjecting. He's given himself $240 extra a week, $240 extra a week, not to mention doubling his housing allowance until he got caught out. I say to Mr. English that this is not a budget that looks after the middle and low income earners. This is a budget, Mr. English, that looks after you and your mates on your level of income, but it is unfair to ordinary New Zealanders. Unfair to ordinary New Zealanders. Mr. Speaker, the cuts in income tax were designed to compensate for GST going up, 2.5% GST. What they will not do is compensate for the rise in the cost of living, because Bill English never told New Zealand that he would be pushing inflation up to 6% after his second budget. 6%, Mr. Speaker. That is the highest rate of inflation that we have seen in decades in this country, and that is going to eat into the living standards and the well-being of our people, Mr. Speaker. National has increased consumption tax by 20%. That consumption tax is regressive, Mr. Key. Mr. Key might have said that the wealthy will pay more GST in dollar terms, but a far higher percentage of the income of low-income earners will be consumed by the GST increase than that of the high-income earners. Make no mistake, that is a regressive tax, and it is not being adequately compensated for by the cuts in income tax. The big cuts in income tax go to the wealthy. The big increases in income being spent on consumption taxes land on the lower and middle income earners. This country now has one of the highest rates of consumption tax in the world because there are no exemptions to that GST. The fourth or fifth highest consumption tax in the OECD. Mr. Speaker, consumers never voted for GST to go up because John Key promised them that it would not go up, Mr. Speaker. Businesses are not in favour of GST going up. In a recent survey of businesses across New Zealand, 8% supported an increase in GST. 8%, Mr. English, of the small businesses